I'm very happy to be here today to present a little bit about the Nexus Assessment, which was approved by member governments at the end of 2024. And so since then, we've been out publicizing the work and sharing it with wider audiences. So I'm really pleased to be joining you today. We also have on the call today Tiff Van Huysen, who was the technical support unit for the assessment. So any questions you have as I'm talking and introducing the findings of our report, you could put in the chat, and hopefully Tiff will be able to help me in responding to some of those. So next slide, please. So the Nexus assessment is available now. There's a summary for policymakers, and then there's 7 underlying chapters. The assessment itself was produced over 3 years. As I said, it was adopted at the end of 2024. It involved the work of over 160 different experts from nearly 60 different countries. We worked very hard to draw on large amounts of knowledge, both peer-reviewed literature. We used over 6,500 different individual sources, and that includes Indigenous and local knowledge as well. So this is something that IPBES very much values and tries to incorporate in assessments. And so this was a really rich range of different types of evidence that are included in the assessment. So you can see the QR code here. This will take you to the summary for policymakers, which is the shorter version of all of the work that was done on the assessment. So I do want to make one note. You can see there's a picture of the cover here, and the report itself is called the Interlinkages Among Biodiversity, Water, Food, and Health. But we also look at these in the context of climate change. So there's actually 5 main, what we call nexus elements that we look at in the report. So next slide, please. So if we could sum up the more than 1,000 pages of the full assessment into just a short summary, these would be some of those key messages of the assessment. And the first one is that we are facing a global poly crisis. We've got a climate change crisis. We've got water insecurity crises. We've got biodiversity loss. We've got food insecurity. We've got health crises in terms of epics of both obesity and non-communicable diseases, but also undernourishment in some places as well. So we've got these major crises and we treat them as separate, but in fact, they're all part of the same problem. And so we need to figure out more integrated solutions. But the good news, and this is our second key message, is that a lot of solutions already exist. They're out there in the world. We just need to scale them up or use them more appropriately. And so our report looked at over 70 different response options that are available to us now that can help us treat these crises in a more integrated and coordinated manner. And finally, the third message is because these crises are so difficult and complex and require so much coordination, the good news is that means there's a role for everyone, that we need people from civil society and local communities to leaders and researchers all working together to help us find solutions to these problems. So next slide, please. So let me share some of the findings of the assessment that were presented in the summary for policymakers. So these are really some of the high-level findings of the assessment. The first is that we were asked to look at past and current trends across biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. And you can see from this diagram that we have a couple of very clear trends. And so in terms of biodiversity, by different indicators, biodiversity is in decline, no matter which way we look at it. We can also see in the middle top graph that freshwater availability is also in decline. We're overusing our water supplies, or they're becoming polluted and less accessible. On the other hand, food supply is going up. We're increasing the amount of food, and you can guess that those things are directly related. So we've focused on producing quantities of food, but that's come at the cost of biodiversity loss and less fresh water. Simultaneously, we're also dealing with climate disasters. You can see the bottom right-hand side. Climate disasters are on the rise, creating extra stresses for the system. And while life expectancy is on the rise, with the exception of the little dip at the end, which is COVID, we also know that that hides a number of problems, such as the rise in non-communicable diseases like obesity and diabetes, which will beginning to have effects on those long-term life expectancy as we see them show up in the data. So we've got a number of crises that need to be tackled, and you can see that these crises cut across all income classes. So from low income to high income countries, we're basically facing, if not the exact same issues everywhere, variants of it. And so we need to tackle these in a more systematic, integrated manner. So next slide, please. So just quickly, what are the drivers of these particular problems? So I'll ask you there's some animation, so just go forward on the animations. So click through the slides here. So go back, yeah, just one. And there's a couple of key drivers. So this diagram shows where we're seeing impacts on biodiversity, water, food, and health. And that's those red arrows. So if you look for red arrows, you can see that's most of this slide. And that means that economic pressures, demographic pressures, cultural pressures such as consumption are all creating negative outcomes across our nexus elements. The only exception where you see some positive trends are those blue arrows around food quantity. So again, this just reinforces the message that we've overemphasized the production of the amount of food, but that comes at the cost of impacts on biodiversity, water health, and climate change. So next slide, please. So as I've said, that we've got these multiple interacting crises, and it really makes it difficult to continue business as usual, which is to treat biodiversity with biodiversity solutions, to treat food with food solutions, that we need to, in fact, treat these as interconnected and not siloed. Well, how can we do that? How can we actually understand these as interconnected crises? Well, we had different ways to do that in our assessment. So next slide, please. One of the things that we looked at in the assessment are future scenarios. So if we make some assumptions about what's going to happen in the future, what will it look like? And one of the things that we found by looking at these different future scenarios is that if we continue to do things as business as usual, if we continue to have high consumption, we're going to have substantial negative outcomes across all of the nexus elements in the future. So biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change are all going to be negatively impacted if we continue business as usual. And you can see that in the figure at the very bottom, all the red arrows. So a continuing nature exploitation scenario, it's not going to give us positive benefits for any of the elements. So future scenarios that prioritize a single nexus element, that is continuing to treat them as individual silos without regard for the other elements, is going to continue to create trade-offs. And you can see that in the three columns that have little orange arrows next to them in the figure. So that's prioritizing only conservation, only climate, or only food. You can see that you get benefits for one thing. So for conservation, we get benefits for biodiversity and for climate, but we get negative impacts on food. So what we want to try to do is balance across the elements. And you can see that in future scenarios in the top two lines where the green arrows are. So there are feasible outcomes for people that are positive, and they usually involve integrated and timely adoption of specific response options. And I'll give you some examples of those response options in just a minute. So next slide, please. So the scenarios that our teams looked at are listed across the top. They were grouped into different, what we called archetypes, and showed us some really interesting patterns with regard to the SDGs as well. So if we're looking at those more positive future scenarios, and so that's column 1 and column 2, you can see a lot of blue, and that means that those particular futures are ones where we're more able to meet SDGs. Everything that has a blue bar is where we're able to meet some of the SDG targets. And you can see on the right-hand side, these are the scenarios that prioritize climate or conservation or food or over-exploitation. We are unable to meet our SDG targets as a result. So all of those red bars are showing us where we're failing to meet SDG targets if we don't change the way that we're approaching these issues. So next slide, please. So I mentioned the idea of response options, and I'll have you just click through while I'm talking. There's a number of different response options. You can keep going on this wheel. I know you won't be able to read all of the lines here, but these are all examples of different response options that the assessment looked at. And you can find details of all of these in section C of the summary for policymakers and the underlying chapter 5, where each of these response options is evaluated in considerable detail. What we did was kind of group them as broad categories for this particular figure. And the response options fall into 10 broad categories: conserving ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, managing ecosystems, consuming sustainably, reducing pollution, integrating planning and governance, managing risk, ensuring rights and equity, aligning financing, and then a small cluster of others. And so for each of these response options, you can see a little smaller color code in the wheel as well. So it's either green for biodiversity or sort of blue for water. And this is just a sign that the particular response option that corresponds to those colors was scored by different chapters. So we had a biodiversity chapter, a water, food, health, and climate chapter. And they came up with a list of response options, around 15 response options per chapter. And we put them all together, and it was really interesting to see where there was a lot of similarity. For example, a response option that the biodiversity chapter chose was also something that the climate chapter chose. And you can see that in a few cases on the wheel where there's two color squares. That means two chapters chose that response option, an example being agroecology. We also found that some response options that were chosen by one sector, like biodiversity, actually had really positive impacts for a sector like water. And it was that sort of cross-scale integration that was so important, that showed us that we were on the right track in thinking about these response options. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of different ways we can think about these response options, and how they benefit multiple Nexus elements. We obviously need to implement them in appropriate ways and accounting for context. So there's a lot of importance in how we do these response options. They're not silver bullets in and of themselves. But what we looked at in the assessment is what the potential benefits might be across the Nexus elements. And you can see in this graphic where we scored each of our response options. Those are the lists. And then if it was broadly positive, we gave it a blue color. If it was potentially negative or might involve some trade-offs, we gave it a red color. And the size of the bubbles in the graphic shows the potential impact. So big bubbles, big impact; smaller bubbles, smaller impact. And you can see that most of the response options we looked at were broadly positive and often very positive in very beneficial, large scale ways. So some of the response options that we think are particularly relevant for small island development states include things like wetland conservation and restoration, having multi-hazard early warning systems, managing for invasive species, having solar voltaics. We've seen how important that's been for Jamaica, that just recently was hit with a terrible hurricane, and focusing on indigenous food systems. So next slide, please. So just to give a couple of case studies of some of these response options. So you can see that this it comes from the health chapter, and it's integrated watershed health interventions from a small island state, so from Fiji. So a lot of examples that might be applicable to folks in the Caribbean. So one of the things that this intervention did was focus on the health benefits of watershed interventions. And so it really was focused on trying to address physical, mental, and cultural health and well-being. And it focused on catchment level integrations by trying to prevent water-related diseases, increasing water security, and conserving biodiversity. So really extending beyond health into biodiversity and water as well. There was also an added element of adapting to climate change by ensuring that there was improved disaster risk reduction through reduced landslides as a result of this intervention. And so the project, which was called WISH, the Watershed Interventions for Systems Health, focused on preventative action, trying to prevent waterborne diseases, particularly for children, participatory and co-design of interventions to make sure that they were culturally appropriate. So things like fencing off livestock to keep them out of important water sources, enabling and enhancing local stewardship so it wasn't driven just from the outside, and really a system of collaboration around the governance of this watershed, bringing in partners from across different areas within one watershed to work together for these common aims. So next slide, please. Another example that came from the biodiversity chapter is an example of area-based conservation or locally managed marine areas. Another great example for small island developing states. These are really people-centered approaches where local communities are really leading or co-managing marine spaces with a focus on biodiversity, but also livelihoods. These are very common across the Indo-Pacific, and I know they're taking root in the Caribbean as well. They have really strong potential to help us meet our Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework goals. A lot of them are recognized as effective area-based measures or OECMs. If we recognize them as OECMs, they could almost double our protected area percentage in some countries, helping us to meet that Global Biodiversity Framework target of 30% protected areas. And the evidence also shows that these locally managed areas also help provide and protect small-scale fisheries, which are so important and can provide up to 50% of household income in some areas where they've been studied in Africa. So next slide, please. So we know that solutions can vary in terms of their transformative potential, and this will be a nice handoff to Fern, who's going to be speaking in a few minutes about the transformative change assessment. And so some of the response options that we looked at primarily help shift practices. And so when you hear from Fern, you'll hear about changes in practices and changes in values and changes in structures. And each of our response options often has a different way of potentially leading to transformative change. So something like ecological intensification is really about changing practices, trying to have a more ecological approach to livestock or agriculture. Something like sustainable healthy diets is really about shifting views and values. It's encouraging people to think about diets as being culturally relevant, health-based, and really embedding that in people's dietary choices. And finally, some of our response options, although a smaller set of them, are really about changing structures and institutions. And these can include things like political changes, inclusion of more marginalized groups, empowering them, such as in rights-based approaches or community water management, to really encourage decision-making at a more local level and build that into structural change. So next slide, please. So the nice thing about these response options is they also help us meet some of our global policy targets and frameworks, whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Biodiversity Framework, as I've already mentioned, or our Paris Agreement goals. And so we looked at the response options and we added up the degree to which they help us meet these targets, and you can see that they were broadly positive. So we hope they'll be a helpful toolkit for people attending the trialogue who may be thinking about how can I embed this in my existing country commitments. We think there's a lot of positive synergy here. So next slide, please. So we also looked at the process of making sure that everybody, as I said, has a role to play in this. How can we actually encourage that? Well, we put together what we call a roadmap of Nexus action, and it has 3 main categories and 8 steps. So if you can click through all of the steps, I'll just talk through them. Great, thank you. Stop right there. So the 3 main categories are exploring the Nexus content. So getting people together and exploring the problem, thinking about what the direct and indirect drivers of change for a problem might be, convening the right actors in a space, and really working towards a common understanding. Then the next step is really building strategic and coordinated action. And that's thinking about visions and aligning values among those disparate actors, identifying those potential response options that might work for your particular context and setting, and then moving to implementation and scaling, understanding what the conditions and the barriers might be to help those response options take off, really negotiating the implementation and strengthening the transformative capacity of these response options through scaling in different ways, and then ensuring that there's ongoing monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And the report outlines a number of decision support tools that can help at every step of this process, everything from participatory models to stakeholder dialogues. There's a lot of tools that are out there that can help people manage these sort of nexus processes. So we hope this roadmap will be a really useful toolkit that folks can use. So next slide, please. So just to kind of wrap up here, I wanted to pose some questions that people maybe can be thinking about before the trialogue, now that you've got this little introduction to the Nexus. And what are some examples that you know of that might exemplify Nexus approaches in your country, in your context? What are the enablers and barriers that have been most important for facilitating, or sometimes in the case of hindering, those Nexus approaches? Are there best practices that you've seen in terms of achieving coordinated action? Like who needs to be in the room? What do they need to be talking about in order to be coordinated? What are the larger financial or economic shifts that might need to happen in order for response options to reach widespread implementation? It could be direct financing, it could be something else that's maybe hindering the scaling up and out. And finally, how can transformative change potential of these response options be mobilized? What can we do to kind of help them reach their full potential? So next slide, I think, is my final conclusion. So hopefully I've given you a flavor of the assessment and you're encouraged to go read it and check it out before the trialogue next week. Again, to reinforce that these are all very urgent problems that we need to tackle, and we hope that the assessment is really providing decision makers with the evidence about these interlinkages. And the important message about there being existing response options. And so kind of picking and choosing and looking at the ones that are appropriate for the context of these different countries that will be convening next week, we think will really be important to move towards more integrated decisions and actions. That may involve some shifts in larger practices of economics and financing and governance. And we hope the dialogue or the trialogue is a really safe space to dialogue about all of these next week. The important role of different actors, who needs to be there, and how can we take this forward, and how can the role of these assessments help countries meet those multilateral agreements. We hope all of this is really helpful for you as you move forward. So I think the next slide is my last one. Thanks for your attention. I'm really glad to be part of this process to prep for the trialogue, and really wishing everyone a successful meeting for the rest of today, but also next week.